Dr. Emma Payne is a visiting research fellow at King's College London in the UK. She recently published Casting the Parthenon Sculptures from the 18th Century to the Digital Age with Bloomsbury Publishing in 2021. And special shout out, if you have not yet read it, I highly recommend it. Dr. Payne is a trained classicist and conservator with research interests including the production of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, conservation and restoration, and reception of classical sculpture, 3D imaging. Dr. Payne's current project is the evolution of technology and the interpretation of classical sculpture. By examining the impact of 19th and 20th century technological change on the scholarly interpretation of ancient objects, this research will reveal the profound effect of advances in sculpture reproduction on the understanding of ancient sculpture, as well as exploring how new technologies continue to exert significant influence in this field. So please, Dr. Payne, when you're ready, you may begin.
So thank you, particularly to Katie, but everyone here for inviting me to speak today. My talk, of course, centers on the Parthenon. So I'm lucky enough to be here in Nashville, Tennessee, whereas there's the most remarkable reconstruction of this building, an ancient Greek temple constructed in Athens in the mid-5th century BC. So it formed part of an ambitious building program organized by the famous Greek general and politician Pericles, following the defeat of the Persian Empire of Xerxes I by the Delian League of Athens around 469 BC. So there were earlier incarnations of the Parthenon on the ancient Athenian Acropolis, but I'm dealing specifically with the Parthenon as we currently tend to know it. So that's the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis, built between around 447 and 438 BC, and ornamented with sculpture between about 438 and 432 BC. So what we now call the Parthenon is this sort of rectangular structure raised on low steps with a Doric colonnade enclosing the building. The interior consists of a large room called the Naos, which housed the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, and a smaller room which functioned as a treasury. And so this is the temple, for which there is this impressive copy here at Nashville. The temple at Athens was adorned with an extensive sculptural arrangement illustrating the foundation myths and civic glory of Athens. So the pediments at the top, so you can see these partly in the sort of triangle shape there. They depicted the contest between the gods Athena and Poseidon to become patron of Athens on the west pediment, and the birth of Athena from the head of the god of Zeus on the east pediment. There were 92 metopes on the four sides of the building. So these are the sort of lower sort of square-shaped sculptures. So they display battle scenes, and finally there's a continuous sculptural frieze, which you can see here. So that's typically thought to depict the festal procession of the Greater Panathenea, which took place in Athens every 4 years. So a significant number of these sculptures now reside at the British Museum in London. At the beginning of the 19th century, Lord Elgin, so the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, of which Greece was then a part, arranged with the Ottoman authorities to remove parts of the sculptures from the building to be taken to Britain. He subsequently sold them to the British government, which bought them to be displayed for the nation in the British Museum. So the British Museum now houses the largest portion of the Parthenon sculptures outside of Athens. And these have often been known as the Elgin Marbles, a name which is often now considered inappropriate because of Elgin's role in separating the sculptures and taking them away from Athens. So I tend to call them the Parthenon sculptures instead. This has obviously been a matter of controversy ever since the sculptures were taken, and I think it seems increasingly likely that ultimately they will be returned to Greece, probably fairly soon. But what I'm most interested in from Elgin's campaign is the fact that alongside removing these original pieces of sculpture, he also arranged for plaster casts to be made of many of the sections that he left in situ. So this is an often overlooked element of Elgin's campaign. and I would argue a positive element of an otherwise problematic episode. And it's ultimately from casts like this that the Nashville Parthenon was constructed. Elgin was not the first to make casts of the Parthenon sculptures. The earliest full-size casts were those made by the French artist Fauvel, who worked for the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier. So he was his French counterpart, the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He started moulding from the Parthenon in the 1780s, so about 15 years before Elgin's retinue arrived. And Fauvel had scaffolding set up on the Parthenon, and his notes suggest that he used clay to make moulds of the sculptures there. He would soak the moulds with soap and oil used as a release agent, and then pour in plaster to make casts. And the plaster there available to Fauvel was poor. It needed to be supported with wood or iron struts, and many of these casts were broken on the journey back to France. The second major casting campaign was, of course, that of Elgin, which took place at the very beginning of the 19th century. This work was conducted under the supervision of Giovanni Battista Lucieri, who was a draftsman, but also Elgin's general overseer of the project. And they had two plaster craftsmen employed, Bernardino Lidis and Vincenzo Rosati. And again, they had to construct scaffolding, and they packed their own plaster, it seems this time, perhaps having learnt from Fauvel's experience. And so rather than using clay to mould the sculptures, they produced more durable piece moulds from plaster, which is also typically better at capturing fine sculptural details. Although capturing these details, though, plaster is quite rigid. And so to make the process possible, moulds of complex sculptural forms like these need to be constructed from multiple pieces, sometimes called tasselli, to avoid undercuts. So these are made by applying plaster to the sculpture in sections and making a mother mould to hold all the pieces together, which you can see is being done in this diagram. So all of these components are then removed from the sculpture and reconstructed empty, allowing plaster to be kind of poured in and set, and then the mould removed once more. The principle of this moulding and casting technique is quite straightforward, but in practice it requires very, very skilled craftsmanship, not just concerning like the physical working of the plaster, but also things like the decision making needed to figure out how to divide the sculpture up into tasselli. And sometimes particularly complex sections of the mould might be made in slightly more flexible materials like wax or resin, just to help with capturing those details and removing them safely. Other materials might be used out of necessity, as with Fauvel using clay. And it seems that Elgin's men may also have experienced some problems maintaining a further supply of plaster, and sometimes also perhaps use clay and wax. And so this is suggested by the writings in the diaries of the architect Robert Smirke, who travelled through Greece on his grand tour at the time Elgin's retinue was working. Nevertheless, rather than casting from the moulds in Athens and shipping fragile casts, as Fauvel had done and many of them broke, instead Elgin's men shipped the somewhat more durable moulds to Britain, where casts were made there in London by a man named Papira in 1808. So Lidis and Rosati had made moulds for most of the accessible sections of Parthenon sculpture left in situ in Athens, notably including almost the entire west frieze of the Parthenon. So after the purchase of Elgin's collection of Parthenon sculpture and casts by the British government, they went in 1816 to the British Museum. And these early casts would then form the initial basis around which the British Museum's cast collection was gradually built up over the next 100 years or so. And during this period, plaster casts were very widely collected by museums and galleries, universities, art schools, for a range of different reasons. So to provide models for drawing, but also to bring together different material from around the world to support various art historical theories. But a central factor at the British Museum to the role of the casts there was this capacity for them to preserve archaeological evidence that might otherwise be lost. So Elgin himself had testified to the British government that he removed the sculptures, not only because the Ottoman authorities had left them to crumble, but because they had been actively damaging them. So he says here, the Turks have been continually defacing the heads. And in some instances, they have actually acknowledged to me that they've pounded down the statues to convert them into mortar. It was upon these suggestions and with these feelings that I proceeded to remove as much of the sculpture as I conveniently could. Now, obviously, Elgin was quite keen to justify his actions there, but there's no reason to doubt the destruction that he talks about, which was also indicated by other sources. So rather, we might perhaps see Elgin as part of these same destructive forces, but with slightly different motivations. So the Parthenon, as we now see it, is not an untouched ruin. So not only has it been the subject of various restoration projects in more recent years, but it experienced a long and varied history, becoming a church and then a cathedral between around AD 600 to 1458, when it was turned into a mosque under the Ottoman Empire. The building had been damaged by fire in late antiquity and was subject to some degree of iconoclasm, which seems to have involved the destruction of a number of the metaphors when it was converted to a church. But the most disastrous event, which is depicted here, was the Venetian bombardment in 1687, which devastated most of the middle section of the south side of the building. And then, of course, Elgin came along and started to take away pieces, both those which had fallen to the ground and by sawing away sections still on the building. Further pieces of sculpture from the Parthenon would be discovered in excavations on the site later in the 19th century. So having acquired Elgin's cast, the British Museum now started to actively seek out casts as a means to accurately record sculptures perceived to be at imminent risk of decline, but for which the museum could not obtain the original. So this included pieces of Parthenon sculpture subsequently found on the Acropolis in the 1830s, 1840s, and later. And the British Museum also started to then supply casts of sculptures to other institutions, both in Britain and further afield. In 1869, Charles Newton, so he was then the keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum, he noticed that Elgin's early moulds had become worn out. And in 1872, he acquired new casts from Consul Merlin in Athens. When these arrived in London, Newton noted some areas of apparent deterioration of the original West Parthenon frieze, evident when comparing these new Merlin casts against the older Elgin casts. And so as a result of that, between 1873 and 1939, the British Museum displayed these two sets of casts together. So they were deliberately juxtaposed to demonstrate this change in condition of the frieze. And in 1929, as you can see on this slide, photographs were published in the Illustrated London News, further documenting this fact. And so comparing recent photographs of the Parthenon with the casts on display at the British Museum. This large spread was published comparing photographs of Elgin's casts with those taken of the originals in situ by Walter Heger for the German Archaeological Institute in Athens in 1928. And the level of deterioration indicated by the photographs, having occurred then over less than a century, suggested a sharp increase in the rate of decay during this period. This idea that some casts may contain valuable archaeological information, no longer evident in the original sculpture, is the central theory on which much of my research is focused, relating particularly to instances like the Parthenon sculptures where the surface condition of the original appears to have been better when it was moulded and cast than it is today. So in theory, such differences will only now be heightened since the west frieze of the Parthenon, for example, remained outside in situ until 1993. So we would expect there to be even more differences in surface condition between the originals and the casts than there were in the 19th century or indeed in the 1920s. The question now then is how we study these casts and how we identify and analyse any useful information preserved within them. And that's one of the main topics of my book. But why do we care about these fine surface features? Well, not only can they reveal details about the state of preservation for conservators, but they can also provide archaeologists with crucial information regarding practical aspects of their creation, including the tools and processes used, which can help us to understand more about the nature of ancient stonework, as well as the function and intent behind particular sculptures. So why a particular surface finish was chosen, for instance. We might find differences between those selected for different subjects, so gods or human or male or female. And while the casts won't obviously contain material evidence like the precise type of stone used or pigments applied, since we now know that the Parthenon sculptures were painted, the way that the surface was finished can still be quite informative on these issues. And this information found in the uppermost surface layer of the sculpture may be preserved in good casts, but lost from original sculptures, since of course this is the layer most vulnerable to damage, like weathering and vandalism. So the casts that are most likely to contain surface details like these lost from original are those made from sculptures that remained in an outdoor context for many years after they were moulded. So the frieze of the Parthenon, with the west frieze in particular, then having stayed outside in situ until the early 1990s, presents an ideal study for this use of casts. So the west frieze depicts a moving procession of horsemen preparing for the Great Panathenæa Festival. It started from the southwest corner of the temple and ran towards the northern side, where the horsemen continued into the north frieze. So given the size of the objects and the fact that they're housed in different countries, so we've got the casts in the British Museum, in this case, in the original still in Athens, it's not possible to make effective side-by-side comparisons between the casts and the originals. We can, of course, use photographs, but while these can be useful, especially when there are very obvious differences, and the appearance of photographs can really change quite substantially in different lighting conditions, and which can make it very difficult to use them for detailed comparisons. Nowadays, however, of course, we have far more advanced technologies available to us than when the published comparisons were made using photographs in 1929. So I used 3D scanning, scanning both the casts and the original marble sculptures to make 3D models of them for precise analysis and comparison of surface morphology. So the 3D models then can record fine topographical details to facilitate study of the current surface appearance and the condition of the casts and marbles. And then the two sets of models can be visually compared, but also mapped together to indicate differences. So just to give you an overview, I used a triangulation-based 3D scanning system that uses structured light scanning. This means that stripes of light are projected onto the object, which are identified with numbers, and then cameras observe distortions in the patterns when compared with what would be expected if they were projected onto a flat plane. And then because the cameras capture the fringe pattern from fixed angles, you can get precise coordinates generated from this information and make accurate scaled 3D models. So I scanned sections of the 19th century casts at the British Museum, and then also scanned the corresponding portions of the marble sculptures at the Acropolis Museum to compare the different sets of data. And where possible, I scanned both the earlier and the later casts at the British Museum, so both those at Elgin and those ordered by Merlin, to try to find out the extent of the deterioration of the frieze that occurred through the 19th century. So I compared the sets of data by overlaying the corresponding models, 3D models, onto each other in the software and creating these deviation maps, which highlight and quantify differences using colour scales. So within these quantitative comparisons, you can then also set different maximum deviation limits, which reveal different sets of information. So you can see these deviation maps in the slide, where green basically means that it's very close, yellow is fairly close, and red is quite different. And then the whitish grey areas are beyond the deviation limit set. So you can see to the left-hand side, we've got 5mm maximum deviation, so quite a lot of the sculpture is covered, down to the 1mm deviation where not very much is. And my interpretation of the comparative analysis I made that was informed by previous work by Bernard Frischer, who had demonstrated that a good first generation cast, so from a fresh mold taken directly from the original, will reproduce most of its surface to within 1 millimetre. Unfortunately, museum records surrounding casts are typically rather poor, partly because until recently they haven't generally been accessioned as proper objects. Several of the British Museum's Merlin casts are lost, but those remaining are first generation casts. And following the research of the former and much missed British Museum curator Ian Jenkins, we know that the Pira's Elgin casts were dismantled from exhibition in 1939, at which time it was discovered that their condition had seriously declined. So they were moulded again in gelatin and 2 new sets made. So most of this set of casts survives to this day, but it does mean that the Elgin casts, as they now exist, are no longer first generation casts. Fortunately, gelatin moulds produce extremely close copies, and they also retain the seam lines from the original plaster piece moulds. So we would still expect them to be very high quality casts. In a nutshell, based on Frisch's findings, I expected that deviations from the original of over 1 millimetre in the Merlin casts and then 2 millimetres in the Elgin casts could reasonably be assumed to relate to subsequent changes to the original or to differences perhaps introduced by those who made the casts. And so these were known as the formatori, the plaster craftsmen, rather than a loss of detail from the moulding process itself. The role of the formatori is one of growing interest to researchers like myself, particularly when it comes to the possibility that they might include their own touches to the cast. But this is an issue which I'll return to shortly. On the whole, the deviation maps showed that the casts were even more accurate than I had expected. So typically I excluded substantial changes of more than 5 millimetres, which were most likely caused by factors like weathering in conjunction with severe pollution or vandalism rather than poor moulding practice. And after these exclusions, the results of the comparative analysis using the 3D scanning showed that both sets of casts reproduced the marble sculptures to well within the levels of deviation anticipated. So the deviation between the Elgin casts and the marble sculptures was consistently less than 2 millimetres, and in most cases was also within 1 millimetre, which you can see on this table. The deviation between the Merlin casts and the marble sculptures was consistently less than 0.5 millimetres. The average deviation between the Elgin and Merlin casts was just under 1 millimetre, and so very similar to that seen between the Elgin casts and the marble sculptures again. So these results suggest 2 things. Firstly, that the 19th century formatori were capable of producing extremely accurate casts. And secondly, that the sculptures appear to have experienced a period of decline in condition through the 19th century, and particularly in the years between the time when Elgin's casts were made right at the beginning of the century and the time of the Merlin casts in the early 1870s. So while the Merlin casts show relatively little deviation from the original marble sculptures today, many of the Elgin casts reveal features that appear much sharper and crisper than those of either the Merlin casts or the marble sculptures. So analysis of the scans indicates various different types of deterioration. So for instance, blunting of the facial features in figures 5 and 6 of West Frieze Block 3 is a fairly characteristic result of sugaring of the marble, which is a common type of deterioration caused by weathering. The other sharper areas of damage might be attributable to vandalism and can be seen on the noses of both figures here and the eye also of figure 6. The Elgin cast, though, appears to show the features much more clearly. So this is the Elgin cast. And we can see it more clearly by looking at the deviation map comparing the original and the Elgin cast. So we can see here very substantial surface loss indicated by the grey areas. So we've got the marble to the left, the Elgin cast in the centre and the deviation maps to the right with the 1 millimetre maximum limit. Further vandalism is evident in figure 15, which is a bearded cavalry commander on West Frieze Block 8. While present in the Elgin cast, the head of this commander is totally missing in the marble sculpture and the Merlin cast. And this loss presents as a shear fracture from the stone. And this sort of fracture can occur naturally with large-scale exfoliation as aluminosilicate veins decay in the marble. However, we know that the frieze was vandalized, and we know that the heads in particular were targeted for petty attacks and removal for collectors. So what we can also see in the 3D scans is small chisel marks around the outline of the head, suggesting the latter in this case. Other areas that I looked at included West Frieze Block 12 here, with figure 23 standing in the centre, in front of a horse. His right arm is raised, perhaps in the act of giving an order, and in his left he holds a riding prop. To the left is figure 22, so a youth looking down at an object, and to the right, the smaller figure 24, probably a servant, carrying a Hermatian over his left shoulder and holding an object in his right hand. Like with block 3, it's clear there's been general weathering, causing blunting of the features, like the locks of the hair and the details on the face. There are also, again, sharper and more substantial areas of loss to the forehead of figure 22 and to the face and right forearm of figure 23. And as with the loss of the head of the cavalry commander in block 8, these substantial losses are already visible in the 1872 Merlin cast here, while the features are relatively sharp and complete in the Elgin cast. So this is the deviation map, comparing the Merlin cast and the original. While this is the deviation map of the Elgin cast and the original, clearly showing the face. Surface textural analysis of this block is also very interesting. So I used algorithmic calculations of curvature in the 3D Sonic software to characterize surface roughness of the casts and the original sculptures. And so this analysis suggests that certain areas of the original sculptures were deliberately textured. So here we can see that the hair and the clothes of the figures, for example, are noticeably rougher than the smooth planes of skin and background of the frieze. So in this slide, we have the casts at the top, Elgin and Merlin, and then the original sculpture at the bottom. And the surface working is more apparent in the casts than the original. So demonstrating not only that fine details of the original sculpture can be closely transmitted to the casts, but also that this change of medium can allow textural distinctions to be analysed more effectively. So specular reflection can pose a real problem when imaging crystalline, translucent surfaces like marble, while plaster is much less reflective and promotes higher quality 3D models, which is really important because this sort of detail isn't really apparent to the naked eye. And it's likely that the rougher surface texture of the hair and clothes relates to this application of different paints to the sculpture. As we know, they would have been brightly coloured, and it shows the sculptor and the painter working quite closely together. The final section of the West Frieze that I analysed was block 16, so depicting figure 30, which is a standing nude youth with a cloak hanging over his left shoulder and arm. And the condition of this figure is the poorest of those examined. The features of the face have almost been entirely washed away, and we find blunting of features across the whole figure. And there's also a fracture across the upper left side of the block, which may be attributed either to one of the violent events in the Parthenon's history or to an early aborted attempt to remove the block from the frieze. So what I want to bring up here again, there is the practices of the formatori, the cast makers. So my analysis so far has shown that these early casts can be incredibly accurate and can provide us with some really useful archaeological information. In addition to this, the deviation maps also reveal some new features introduced during the moulding process. So incremental reduction of the maximum permitted deviation can reveal finer degrees of difference between the surface of the cast and the marble. So this includes not only seam lines, which we can see in this image here, which we expect from casts made from the piece mould, but also areas where different sections of the piece mold are slightly fractionally offset. So we can see this with the kind of red shading. So showing that they're offset rather than completely flush. And these are still pretty tiny flaws though. This offsetting is less than 1 millimeter. So it's still a very high quality cast. But careful observation though can reveal more significant interventions made by the formatory. So Ian Jenkins noted in the Elgin cast of figure 30 in block 16 that there had been an addition made by the formatory to fill in areas of damage to this sculpture. So the addition both makes the sculpture easier to cast, potentially helping to reduce any issue of undercutting. But it also restores the original form of the figure, making it more readable to the viewer. So a focus of my research has also been to try and discover to what extent these casts faithfully represent lost archaeological details and to what extent they've been manipulated. So at first glance, it appears that there was a significant period of decline in condition of the sculptures between about 1802 and 1872, so when the Elgin casts and the Merlin casts were made. But if the Elgin casts were perfected by the formatory, then perhaps this wasn't the case. And perhaps the damage occurred earlier, followed by a much slower continued decline, rather than the headline-grabbing deterioration suggested by the Illustrated London News. Again, the 3D models can help us to answer these questions. So additions like those found in figure 30 were probably modelled with pieces of clay by the formatory. And then once the plaster's been cast into the moulds, it can be extremely difficult to identify any such interventions with the naked eye. So the deviation maps and surface texture analysis can help us to locate such instances. So for instance, the deviation map of figure 23 here shows some patterns of change around the hand, which strongly suggests some sort of intervention in the mould and cast. And the 3D model of the face also reveals some distinctions in texture between those parts still extant and those parts lost. And these also clearly follow a seam line in the cast, interestingly. And so it's possible that this head was made up in the casts by the formatory, perhaps in clay. Although this example also shows that there's a certain level of subjectivity involved when trying to understand these objects. The earlier casts of Fauvel, made in the late 18th century, then form an important source of evidence when trying to figure out all of these details. So while many were lost or damaged en route to France, there are derivations of some that still exist. So there's some at the Akademische Kunstmuseum at the University of Bonn, which were purchased from Paris in 1821. And these are particularly informative for our analysis of figures 5 and 6 here, and they're from block 3 of the West Frieze. And the deviation maps we've got here compare the Elgin casts and the original sculptures. So you can see by looking at the kind of grey areas that the faces of both figures are much, much more complete in the cast. Oddly, however, the noses of these figures appear sharper and more complete in the Elgin cast than in the cast at Bonn. So this is in spite of the fact that the Bonn cast should reflect the condition of the Parthenon sculptures some 15 years earlier than the Elgin casts. So if we were to expect any difference at all, we would really expect it to be the other way around entirely. So therefore, I would suggest here that the formatory of the Elgin moulds and casts most probably modelled small pieces of clay to reduce the appearance of existing damage to the facial features. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to create 3D models of the casts at Bonn to make deviation maps, but what we can see in the surface texture analysis here of the Elgin casts are more discrepancies, so primarily to the tips of the nose, and marks which I consider perhaps to be clay smoothing lines, which are also possibly evident in figure 30. So you can see these lines across the addition that Ian Jenkins pointed out. So in my view, therefore, it's quite clear that there were these additions, or perhaps we might term them restorations, to these early Elgin casts. Indeed, Elgin had himself originally intended for the marble sculptures themselves to be restored, but this plan changed following input from sculptors like Hanover, who thought that they shouldn't be touched. The fact that the Parthenon sculptures, made famous by their arrival at the British Museum, were not restored was a significant factor then in the more conservative approach to restoration that prevailed as the 19th century progressed. So there don't appear to be any such interventions made to the Merlin cast as far as I can see. And also through the 19th century, more and more attention was paid to the possibility for the casts to provide a means through which the form of vulnerable sculptures could be preserved. So importance then was attached to the presence of these casting seam lines, which I've mentioned. So if they weren't present, then they must have been sanded away. And even that level of intervention to the delicate surfaces of the cast was deemed completely inappropriate. There are a couple of quotations that I've given here where they talk about the gossamer-like threads found on the casts, or if they become thick ridges, then that's really bad. So the seam lines needed to be present, and they needed to be really fine, like these spider webs. Otherwise, larger seam lines would suggest the use of a mould that had passed from many times before and was becoming worn out. So once the casts were created, then close attention was paid to their care, with special equipment and chemical treatments devised to clean and preserve their surfaces, ideally without changing the colour and without adding these thick disfiguring layers of varnish, which we often see on casts now, often applied in the 20th century, actually, when the casts typically receive less attention. But in the mid-19th century, there was one Dr. Reisig, who was awarded a prize by the Prussian government for his formulation of a way to make casts water resistant by converting the upper layer of calcium sulfate, so the gypsum plaster, into an insoluble compound like barium sulfate or calcium silicate. And Reisig's work was built upon and further developed by Dr. von Deschend, who designed a machine to treat and clean plaster casts, which I've got part of the patent here. So this comprised an adjustable atomizer nozzle attached to a fine spray of hardening and cleaning preparations onto casts of different shapes and sizes. So these would be sort of sprayed onto the surface to protect them. And the machine could also produce a stream of air to remove dust from the cast without wiping. So wiping dirt on something like a cast or anything really will often produce a really ugly streak, which you want to avoid. And it reduces the risk of staining using this method. And by 1885, this apparatus had been installed at many museums across Germany, and by 1890 had made its way across the Atlantic to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and had also been ordered by museums in New York, Chicago, and Norwich. So in many collections, such careful treatments of casts declined through the 20th century as the value assigned to such objects declined, and so often they started to become viewed as poor surrogates of the originals, as plaster dinosaurs, rather than as retaining important archaeological information or as significant objects in their own right. What I hope my research has shown is that they can be both. The casts themselves are diverse. So many historical casts can and do have an important role as archaeological time capsules, if you like, so preserving these details now lost from the original sculptures. And even the Elgin casts, with these little interventions, they do for the most part reproduce the marble sculptures with really extraordinary accuracy. But we need to approach these casts as the important multi-layered objects that they are. So they contain complex layers of craftsmanship, all of which are interesting, but which can be easy to muddle if, for example, we approach them purely as surrogates for the original sculptures. So the evidence of the hand of the formatore in the Elgin cast shows how carefully we need to investigate such objects And with care, it certainly is possible to uncover these ancient archaeological details, but they can also reveal a new wealth of information relating to 19th century artistic taste, attitudes to sculptural reproduction and restoration, and the reception of ancient sculpture. So I'd like to finish by bringing this background to Nashville's Parthenon. And so while it's not obviously the focus of my research, with its sculptural ornament completed in the 1920s and 1930s, it's a kind of physical culmination of this copy practice, extending back over 100 years plus, and built upon numerous iterations of plaster casts made from these important classical sculptures from the late 18th century onwards and spreading around the world. And the way that these casts were made and their precise relationship with the original sculptures is a topic of growing interest for archaeologists and art historians and conservators. And I know, having chatted already today, that there's lots of new and excellent work on this subject being conducted here in Nashville, which I greatly look forward to hearing more about during the next couple of days that I have here. So I just want to thank everyone again for listening, and Katie for inviting me.
First, thank Dr. Payne so much for her words today. We found her book when we started doing research for our cast collection, because we, as of this week, have started a months-long conservation project. Our cast collection has been here at the Parthenon for 100+ years, just about, and so they are getting some much needed attention, and Emma's work was so fascinating to read and really understand the history of casts, and how they have gone from documenting archaeological evidence to forgotten in the storerooms to now having a real resurgency. So I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Feel free to keep entering questions in the chat and Q&A, and I will begin directing them then to you, Emma, in just a minute here. I think the first question I saw was in the chat, and I partially know the answer, but you might be able to reflect with some extra information. Do we know which molds were used to create the casts for the Nashville Parthenon? We know they were made in 1923. So perhaps, Dr. Payne, do you know about which molds were most commonly used in that era of the 1920s?
Yeah, so I don't, this is obviously something that's part of the ongoing research, which the conservator Ava is working on at the moment. So my understanding is that they come via the Bricciani workshop from London, which was based mainly at the V&A, but kind of came from the British Museum earlier on. I don't know exactly which date those molds would have been made in. Yeah, so that's an area for further research. My guess would be that they were mid-19th century, but I'm not 100% sure.
And our curator, Jennifer Richardson, is also joining us at the symposium today, and she mentioned that our casts were made to order, which is fun to think about in terms of a cast. The next question I see, and you mentioned this briefly, but could you reflect on some thoughts on the UK returning the statues to Greece? You mentioned that the news is talking a lot about this recently.
I think this has been in the works for a while, and I think the last few months has been the most promising recently for the return. It's sort of being spearheaded by George Osborne, who was a politician in the UK. I don't know how much the audience knows about UK politics. And perhaps I shouldn't go too much into that. But I think I think they're very likely to be returned under some sort of loan agreement. So the problem, or so I don't fully understand all of the legal aspects that the museum and the government deal with, but my understanding is that the museum under UK law doesn't exactly have the right to return the sculptures, because they sort of own them on behalf of the government, if you see what I mean. But I think there'll be some sort of loan agreement, long-term loan. Yeah, I would expect that to happen maybe in the next year.
Yeah,
but I might be completely wrong. Maybe it will all fall through. Who knows?
The next question we have: are there any elements of the casting process that lead to deterioration of the original marbles?
Yes. So even sort of pulling plaster off. So obviously you put a release agent. The release agent itself is problematic. So release agents can stain. You obviously need to make sure that you wash it all off very carefully. Ava and I were actually chatting about this earlier, and we were mentioning that that it just doesn't happen so often anymore that molds are made because the process is risky. So you could pull little bits of marble off. You have the staining problems. It's quite laborious as well. So you have your lovely sculpture covered up by plaster for a while, which most museums won't really want. 3D scanning obviously represents kind of potentially the way forward with this for making reproductions, which we're seeing more and more with 3D prints. The issue with that is that generally even the plaster cuts, I would say, are still higher quality than the 3D prints generally, unless perhaps you pay really, really expensive ones.
Thank you. Our next question, you mentioned some waterproofing compounds. Were these in use in the 1920s, around the time our Parthenon casts were made?
So this is another thing that we're looking at. I don't know for sure. So certainly there was a lot of research, there was a lot of discussion at the South Kensington Museum, which became the V&A, and the British Museum, I think the Science Museum, this is all in London, by the way, were working on recipes alongside all these ones in Germany. Often when they would bring casts over, so they might order casts from Germany, and they would request for them to be treated with these compounds so that they were more durable. So one of the problems with plaster is it's so porous that it gets stained and dirty really easily, and you can get water damage. And so this just helps to prevent that a little bit. What I don't know is what was actually going on in the workshops, particularly with ones that were being sent to other places. So a lot of this discussion was happening in-house, whereas like places like Britannia were slightly separate. And as we were also mentioning in our discussions earlier, craftsmen often have their own sort of secret recipes. My guess is that they probably were treated with something, yes. Perhaps they were soaked in a soap solution. But we would need to do more scientific analysis to try to find that out for sure.
Yeah, and what's also interesting for our casts, and whether they had a waterproofing seal or not, they were used to make molds to pour concrete to make the pediment sculptures on the outside of the building.
Yeah, so they will have been covered with release agent.
So something would be on them to some extent, but they did not arrive and sit in a empty storage room. They were put to use upon arrival. And our curator, Jennifer Richardson, messaged me to mention that they were also requested to arrive hastily so that they could be used in the reconstruction of our Parthenon here. So yeah, not only special order, but speedily order.
It's possible then that the treatment that was applied might be slightly different, perhaps to ones that weren't ordered hastily. Interesting to note also that the store casts at the British Museum, which perhaps had a similar function, so they were made so that you could make more molds from them in the future. They were generally coated with shellac to make them extra durable and to help with the release as well.
All right, I'm combing the chat here for some additional questions. So if you do have lingering thoughts or questions, feel free to keep adding them in the chat or the Q&A section. We have a couple minutes for some more questions here. Let's see. Oh, we have a comment here that says, fascinating talk. I hadn't realized how much the Elgin casts had been touched up, as it were. And are the illustrations that you showed included in your book?
Yes, they are. You can also see, if you go to the British Museum, which I don't know what they'll do if the marble sculptures go back, but they have a little gallery kind of before you go into the main room, which has casts of the West Frieze off to the side. It's an interesting one though, that gallery, because they have a funny mixture of casts, where some of them obviously relate to the Elgin casts and some of them are later. So it's not a kind of coherent chronology, but it's interesting to have them.
Yes, and that's also one of the things that I really enjoyed seeing too, and thinking about our casts and some of the touch-ups, but also some of the surface differences and variations, especially, with our set of casts having been exposed to elements and exposed to materials, and thinking about how that changes their condition over time. Have you noticed any significant differences in pedimental sculpture as well as the frieze? Maybe casts of those.
I haven't run comparisons of those because obviously the British Museum brought the originals. Well, Elgin brought the originals and they're in the British Museum, so we don't have the same time lapse where they were outside weathering. So you're not likely to get as much difference. What I have looked at, which I didn't talk about today, which I mentioned a bit in the book, is that obviously once objects come into a museum, that doesn't mean that they're kind of cryogenically frozen in time. And there was this whole controversial episode with cleaning. So potentially, yes, there might still be areas of the cast where the surfaces of the cast, it's interesting to compare the two. And as we're noting today as well, sometimes further fragments have been found, so the the casts may show more pieces together than we have with the original.
We have another question here. Can you share more about who is working on returning sculptures from the British Museum to Greece? Is it the Acropolis Museum, special interest groups, etc.? It's a pretty big coalition.
I mean, I don't know everyone who's involved, but it's all the high players.
Yeah. It seems to be a government conversation.
Yeah, no, it's the British Museum, the government, and the Acropolis Museum.
And probably the archaeological restoration services and
so
very
everyone,
very high level authorities working on it. Let's see. I think that is all the questions I see. We have a lot of comments saying thank you and comments saying it was very interesting. And so we will end it here. Emma, thank you so much for
thank you for having me,
sharing your research, for presenting your research, for publishing your research, and also for your time and consideration working with our casts here in Nashville. Believe it or not, Emma is right behind me in the office next door. And if you happen to be in Nashville, you might see us out and about the Parthenon this weekend, looking at the casts as the conservation project begins. We will have more symposia coming up. Our next one is February 8th at 9 a.m. It will be with the fantastic head conservator from Corinth Excavations, Nicole Anastasatu, and she will be sharing kind of a conservation 101. What is archaeological conservation? To give us a background of conservation information. And then our conservator, Ava, who's here on site today, who's conserving our casts, will give a symposium in March to share some of the initial results of her conservation work with our cast collection. So if you like archaeological conservation, now is the time to join us over the next couple months here at the Parthenon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to Centennial Park Conservancy for sponsoring the Cast Conservation Project, to the Hays Foundation for their generous support of the Cast Conservation Project. And hopefully you will join us all in February. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.